Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for our main event! Hosted by Eric McMahon, it's Cageside with John Morgan!
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Cageside with John Morgan. I am your host, Eric McMahon. Now, last week, we recapped a wild weekend in MMA. We had a lot of promotions going. We had UFC, Bellator, One Championship, and bare knuckle fighting. Still the best value buy there is out there for us fans. This week, I have something really cool in store for all of you, but coming off the heels of CFFC calling the show, calling the matches that week, I want to bring in another cool guy. John Morgan, how was your weekend, man?
It was good, man. I always enjoyed doing CFFC shows. Was out in the Philadelphia area, Parks Casino in Bensalem, Pennsylvania. Another fun show, man. CFFC shows, if you ever get a chance to watch them on Fight Pass. I mean, of course I'm biased because I'm in there calling the fights, but I just honestly, as a fan, I believe the matchmakers, the organization, they do a great job of putting great cards together. And we had another fun one. Main event, we had a heavyweight main event title fight. You know how it is with heavyweights. It seems like you either get right, like just something crazy, or it gets kind of that kind of slow grind. And unfortunately, we got kind of that slow grind. So our main event was a little bit, didn't quite live up to the rest of the show, but we did crown a new undisputed heavyweight champion. So look, great show, great times. And man, we've got a ton of CFSC coming up. We got shows in November, December lined up. The schedule's packed. We got some surprises we haven't even announced yet. So I'm just telling you, if you haven't given us a chance before, get UFC Fight Pass and give us a chance in November, December, because we're going to have a ton of shows.
CFFC is a great promotion. I mean, I think Rod Galvin, some of the other matchmakers, they do a great job. From a production standpoint, it's top notch. I mean, the fighters buy in, the production is bought in. And I'm kind of biased again. I mean, I ref for CFFC a lot of times, and I always love going to a show where, it starts on time. It's that, there's no wasted movement anywhere. And it's just it's a machine, kind of like they're like a mini UFC at this point. They're producing probably more UFC talent now than any promotion out there.
Yeah, really are feeding a lot of people to Dana White's Contender Series straight into the UFC as well. So it's top notch. As you said, they're finding great talent. And the great part about the organization is everybody's okay with the understanding. Look, our job is to find the next stars and get them to the next level. You hear about horror stories sometimes of regional promotions where, they identify some talent and they realize that guy's a draw, and then they want to sit on him a little bit. They want to hang on to him. And that's terrible for the athlete, because all the athletes are trying to get to the UFC, trying to get to Bellator, trying to get to One Championship, trying to get to PFL. And we feel it's our job as a regional organization to help them get to that. Now, as you said, it's a talent developmental organization. It used to be in the Northeast. Now we're all over the country. We're coming to your backyard in November. Yep. We got a show in Florida in November. So we got Atlantic City in December. So a lot of fun stuff on the rise. I actually got a chance to work. I work with CM Punk most of the time. He's my broadcast co-host, but CM Punk's a busy guy, man. He's got a ton of stuff going on. So every now and then he can't make it. And this was a show this past weekend where he couldn't make it, but we had a fill-in of Joe Pyfer. He made his debut on commentary. And let me just say, Joe's a natural at this, man. I was talking to him afterwards. Clearly, he's focusing on his fighting career right now, but Joe Pyfer was phenomenal in the booth. And it's been so cool to see him this year, because a year ago in December, he fought for CFFC. It was his comeback fight. He'd had an injury. He was trying to get back in winning ways. He won for us. Then he went to Dana White Contender Series in his very next fight, got that big knockout, got that moment when UFC President Dana White was saying, you want to be in the UFC, be Joe Pyfer, be like that guy. And then he made his UFC debut and already got, a win there and a bonus there, and then came back and was on the mic. So it's been so cool to see just his growth over the past year and the success that he's had. So he worked with me this past weekend. Again, it's on UFC Fight Pass. If anybody missed it, go check it out. But Joe Pyfer, man, I thought he did a great job on the mic. We had a good time.
And, a lot of those stand-ins for CM Punk have been awesome. I remember a card that I refed. You were in Abu Dhabi, so you couldn't make it. Even Eric Anders was phenomenal on the mic, right? So, and I love how they get this UFC talent to come and be your second on there. There's another great thing about CFFC. Now, if you're going to do it even more regionally than that regional promotion, you may hear a guy like me on there every now and again when I'm not reffing, but hey, maybe one of these days, put in a word to Nick Harmeyer, Jason Lederfine, Rob over there, that, hey, listen, I may not be as good as you, but I think I can hold it down. All right. Just if you need somebody.
I appreciate it. Yeah, we've had some great ones, man. Andre Petrosky has filled in a couple times. Dean Thomas has filled in a couple times. So we've had some great ones. But I'll make sure your name's in the mix.
Love it. All right. So that is John Morgan. You can follow him on Twitter at @JohnMorgan_MMA. My name is Eric McMahon. Again, follow me, E_Mac Life. Now, something cool that I wanted to get into. It's a very slow week in MMA. We really only got one show coming up, UFC Fight Night. There's not a lot of fanfare behind it, but as we said, UFC does a great job of coming, doing these fight nights from the bottom up to develop a lot of this talent to put them in contender status till where the masses will see them on pay-per-view. That is one of these cards this weekend. We'll kind of dive into that, but everybody knows the name John Morgan, that he is just a figure of MMA, from a personality to a journalist, but nobody really knows John Morgan. I actually didn't. And I still don't. I mean, this guy's Rolodex goes so deep, you're a living encyclopedia in this. So I wanted to kind of let's do a deep dive into you right now. Everybody hears you as the first question guy. So I'm just going to give a little bit of an accolade right now. Every single year in the World MMA Awards, you are a finalist for Journalist of the Year. Dare I say, as a pure MMA guy, you are the elite of the elite. You are the best. You as so much as you won it in 2009. Another cool, interesting fact that maybe not a lot of people know, but MMA Junkie, widely considered for years and years and years as the best publication to find your newses and your sources for MMA content. You were the driving force behind that. Now you're out on your own. So I just kind of want to get into it. You started in Dallas. Is that correct? How'd you get started?
Yeah, born and raised in Dallas. That's where I grew up. And it's funny, man. When I was a little kid, I like pro wrestling. I grew up in the Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, Mr. Perfect, Andre the Giant, all that era. And then when I was, probably 8 or 9 years old, I realized that it was scripted entertainment. It broke my heart, man. I thought it was like the greatest thing. And when I realized it was scripted, I was like, dang, well, I don't really like this stuff anymore. I thought it was real competition. But chance encounter, man. I was about 12, 13 years old, and I was brought to a gym opening of a friend of my mom's. And the gym opening was Guy Mesger in Dallas, who was a leading figure, old school figure that maybe some newer fans might not know, but was a phenomenal fighter. Pioneer and a great dude, man, an absolutely great dude. But I saw him, so I went to this gym opening, and first of all, Guy Mesger back in the day, man, good looking dude, tall, put together, had the long hair, the point. I was like, as a 12, 13-year-old kid, I was like, that's a cool looking dude right there. And he's a kickboxer. This was before MMA, mind you. Okay, this is 92, around that, right about the time it got started. But he was a kickboxer, and I thought that was super cool. And more importantly, he had a VHS tape of Muay Thai from Thailand that was playing on this, little TV in there as people were kind of just walking around the gym opening. And I saw these Muay Thai fights, and I thought, oh my gosh, that's what a real fight looks like. In Muay Thai, and this is from Thailand, right? It's passion. It's a national sport. You got the music playing in the background, and everybody's kind of they're betting and gambling and throwing the money around. And then in Muay Thai, for anybody that doesn't know, it's kickboxing, right? But then you add in the elbows, you add in the knees, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is what. And these guys they're killers. They had 300, 400 fights in a career. I mean, it's just amazing. And I saw
a career that could be done by the age of 18.
Absolutely. You can start fighting when you're like 10 years old. It's crazy. They go out there to do it to help support their families. It's insane. I really want to make a trip to Thailand one day. I've never been there. It's a place I want to go because it really was the genesis of me getting into this career. So I want to go check out Muay Thai.
I just want to do a timeout really quick. Yep. I got to go to Bangkok, Thailand. I got to go to Muay Thai fights in Lumpini Stadium.
Oh, man, see, that's on the bucket list for me.
And just so everybody knows, like, it's a little bit different out in Thailand. You have stadium champions, right? You don't have WBA, WBC, or like UFC, Bellator. You have stadium champions out there. The first, and so I was staying in this nice hotel. I went on an NBA trip, and I said, I'm going to Lumpini Stadium. I bought ringside seats, which gave me all access, and it was like $8, right? I got to sit front row. I got to go drink beer and go watch the guys warm up in back as they're warming up with like my beer. And the first fight of the night were like 6-year-olds. It was insanity. Crazy. And like, I knew that like the oi and like all the noises, but that's really to influence the judges for all the people betting.
Unbelievable.
And it was so cool.
It's on my bucket list. I got to go check that out, man. So That's what got me, right? But then that was right around, again, this was 92, 93, when the UFC was just starting out. Pancrase was starting over in Japan as well. And I started following all of this, man. I was started becoming a fan. Back then, that's where the tapes would be at Blockbuster. You go rent the VHS tapes and watch those. I used to subscribe to Full Contact Fighter, which was like this newspaper, basically. I mean, you didn't have the internet where you were getting instant results and what was going on. I mean, you're reading about shows that happened in Brazil, it happened in Russia like a week ago or 2 weeks ago. But I just became a real fan of the sport, to be honest with you, man. I just really started following it passionately from the very beginning. I think the first UFC pay-per-view I ever bought was UFC 7, and the first one I ever attended live was UFC 16 in 98 in Louisiana.
Wow.
And so I was, and you talk about funny. I sat front row. You can actually pull that up on UFC Fight Pass, and you'll see it in the opening shot of the pay-per-view. You'll see a 19, 20-year-old me in the front row. And Eric, I paid like $50 to sit cage side. You can't even get in the door of a UFC event for $50. That's like the price of a cold beer at the arena now. You know what I'm saying? And it's set front row.
Who was the main event that night?
It was Frank Shamrock and Igor Zinoviev. It was the 16-second slam KO. But unbelievable. And I was hooked. I was in, and I became a fan, and I just started following it fervently. And eventually, that led to a career. But that was much later.
So you started in sports in Dallas for the Morning Star. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I did some internship for the Dallas Morning News. When I was in college, Dallas Morning News. When I was in college and kind of wanting to be a journalist, and then what happened was I put myself through school working in restaurants, and then I was like, you know what? Early on, listen, I played baseball, basketball, soccer. I loved athletics. But I realized I wasn't going to be a professional athlete, right? But I wanted to be around sports, and so I was like, well, what if I was a sports writer? Now, again, dating myself here. Back in the day, you could actually just be a writer about sports. Like now, you got to be a videographer, a podcaster, a multimedia editor. You got to. Back then, you could just write. And so I wanted to be just a sports writer. I was like, man, that way I could still be around sports, even though I'm not going to be a player. And then put myself through school, with that passion. But when I got out of school, I got an offer to go work for the Dallas Morning News, but I also got an offer to go into management with the restaurant company I was with called Abuelos. That
love it, by the way.
It's amazing restaurants. That paid like double. It paid like double what I was going to make in the journal. So I was like, well, young kid, I got to pay bills. Let me go do this. And I like the restaurant business, to be honest with you. I mean, I started out as a busboy when I was 16 years old, worked my way up to a server, bartender, went through all the kitchen staff, all that. And I liked the industry. So I went into that. And I was a general manager at like 24 years old, man. I was the youngest GM in the company, had like a restaurant with like 100 people working for me. And I loved it, man. I was making good money and I enjoyed it. But I got to a point around like 27, 28 years old where I was like, man, like I don't hate what I'm doing, but this isn't what I wanted to do. You know what I mean? What I wanted to do was be a sports reporter. And what if I, just look up and, I'm 40, 50 years old, whatever the case may be, and I never gave it a shot. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like I want to give it a shot. And so I started looking for opportunities to get into sports writing. At the time, I was reading this website every day called MMA Weekly. And I was in their forums and all those things. And there happened to be a forum post. And it was Gorgeous George, who still hosts MMA Junkie Radio to this day. Back then, it was called Tag Radio, Trigg and Gorgeous George Radio. He was hosting a show with Frank Trigg. And they were looking for somebody to basically write up recaps of their interviews to post on this website called MMA Junkie. Now, at the time, it was actually called UFC Junkie. That's what it started out as. It was started by three guys, including Dan Stupp, who was the lead editorial guy. Eventually, that caught wind. The UFC caught wind of that and sent a nice little legal suggestion letter that they don't think that should be in there. I think it's called a cease and desist is what it's called. But, it was a suggestion to maybe change the name from UFC Junkie. So it changed to MMA Junkie. But Gorgeous George was looking for somebody to recap interviews that they were doing to put as a story on MMA Junkie, in which they could embed the interview, all that. So basically, they just needed somebody to listen to the interviews, write up recaps of them. And that was an opportunity for me to get back into writing, to be in a sport I was passionate about. So I just reached out to him on that forum, and I was like, hey, I'm not currently doing this, so I don't have like a resume to give you. I've been in restaurant management, but I'd like this opportunity if you're down with it. And he met with Dan Stupp, and they gave me a chance. And so started out just doing that. I would work my 12-hour shift as a restaurant manager, come home, write up a recap for free, just to put the information on the site, and developed a relationship with these guys. And luckily, Dan Stupp, the former editor of MMA Junkie, he liked my work. And when it came time for them to hire somebody, The first employee they hired for the company was me, and just started out part-time.
Awesome.
And so started out as part-time. I made an interesting decision. I was a general manager of a restaurant. I actually demoted myself and put my assistant general manager in front of me as the general manager, so that I didn't have to be there on weekends. Our store policy, our company policy was the general manager had to be there on weekends. I was like, well, if I was the AGM, I could still basically run the whole thing, but I could be off on weekends so I could cover events and that sort of thing. So I did that, and did that part-time for a while. And then eventually Dan gave me the opportunity to go full-time. And I walked away from my restaurant job, and I moved to Las Vegas. I was like a month away. At the time, I was a month away. I was living in Ohio at the time. I was a month away from my lease ending, and I was like, well, wait a minute. If I'm going to do this full time, I don't have to live here. So you know what? Why don't I go to Las Vegas? Why don't I go to the center of all this is happening? And that was in 2008. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to go to Las Vegas. I'm going to relocate out there. I think that'll be good for my career. And that's when the full-time started, and I've been out here ever since.
So to clarify, it wasn't a requirement for you to move to Vegas, but you just know if you're going to do this and be serious, you have to be in the epicenter.
Yeah, that's it. In fact, I mean, the company didn't even pay for my relocating expenses. I just told Dan Stupp, I was like, look, hey, I appreciate the full-time job offer. And you know what's really funny? So at the time when this happened, I was living in Dayton, Ohio. The restaurant I started in Texas. Then I moved to Oklahoma. Then I moved to Kentucky. Then I moved to Ohio, just going to existing restaurants and kind of help, underperforming stores basically. But it worked out great because I was in Dayton, Ohio. Dan Stupp lived at the time in Cincinnati, Ohio. So when it came time to hire somebody, we were actually able to go, drive an hour down the road and meet face to face and talk and kind of develop a relationship. But yeah, so I just decided once he gave me the full-time offer, I was like, Dan, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to move to Las Vegas. So we have somebody in Las Vegas. It just felt to me, if I'm going to try this, I'm going to give it a go. Why don't I be right there in the epicenter of it? Because I think that'll be beneficial to me. There weren't nearly as many events as there are now, of course, but the big ones were in Las Vegas. The UFC, of course, is based in Las Vegas. And it turned out to be a phenomenal decision because, as you know, now the UFC headquarters is funny. Back in the day, people might not know this. It was just a random stretch of office buildings that was like behind an In-N-Out Burger on Sahara. Like it was not like an amazing facility. Now, though, of course, the headquarters is, 15 minutes down the road from me, and it's incredible. I mean, you look at the offices themselves, you look at the UFC Performance Institute, which is this unbelievable gym that the athletes are able to take care of and take advantage of, and a lot of people are moving out to Las Vegas. I mean, it just turned out to be great. And then, of course, the Apex shows, and man, you could get into the pandemic and all the things that happened. I mean, so much has happened, but it just turned out to be a great place. And I'll be honest with you, I love Las Vegas, man. I know a lot of people might come to Las Vegas and party on the Strip for a couple days, and then they leave, and they might say, how the hell does anybody live there? And I get it. To be honest with you, when I moved here, I wasn't even sure, because you go to the Strip for a couple days, you want to get off the Strip. And I was the same way. When I would come here for business, I'm like, dude, get me out. But, I live about 20 minutes away, and we got, great weather out here. We got, low, we don't have state income tax, and the city's growing. Now we got professional sports, man. We got hockey, we got football. And of course, we got the UFC and everything that's done that.
But they say two's not enough. Three's too many.
That's right. That is the truth.
Like, okay, so you move to Vegas, you start being able to cover this more full time. Logically speaking, you're getting a little more access here and there. At that point, how hard was it to be credentialed into UFC events?
Oh, it was super tough, man. It was really, really tough. In fact, in the early days, it was wild. So the UFC would not even credential me or Dan Stupp as part of MMA Junkie. Since I was getting back into writing, I reached out to the Dallas Morning News again to see if I could do some work for them. And I did a little bit of freelance work for them. Meanwhile, Dan Stupp actually worked for the Dayton Daily News. So they would only credential us through our newspaper connections, basically. And in fact, it's a funny story because the PR head at the time, her name's Jen Wink, great person. She's still in PR to this day. She's become a good friend of mine. But she was a hard ass, man, at the time. And I remember she would tell me and Dan, she's like, just so you know, if I walk by on press row and I see either one of you guys have an MMA Junkie page open, I'm kicking you out because you're here for your newspapers. So, this is crazy. So this is a time, and it's just crazy to think about what a different area it is. At the time, like right now, when there's a UFC event, you could see every fight, right? It's going to be on Fight Pass. It's going to be on ESPN Plus, wherever it may be. This was a time back in the day in 2008 when the prelims were dark. The only way you could watch the prelims was if you were in the building. They didn't have a broadcast deal for all of them. So we would do play-by-plays on our website but we couldn't have our website open because we'd get in trouble with the USCPR. So we would have like Slack open, and we would be typing out play-by-plays, and then you'd have to copy and paste that into Slack so that whoever was at home could then copy and paste it from Slack and put it into the website so we didn't get in trouble. So that's how we got around it. It was a crazy time.
Talk about, and now like the UFC lives off these independent sites. I mean, it's a huge thing. Okay, so Harding, like at what point, and this brings up a great, interesting question that I hadn't even put on my list to ask you. When did that pendulum shift?
I would say it started to shift when it started before around 2010, 2011. Our site started growing. I think they started respecting the professionalism of the site, the dedication that we had, the fact that they saw that, hey, we are professionals at this. Dan Stupp was a phenomenal editor, man. And he had a very dedication to professionalism, AP style in the presentation. I mean, and I think they started to realize that. And then in 2011, we grew to a site, to a size where we got on the radar of Gannett, which is the owner, the parent company of USA Today. And in 2011, they purchased us. So we went from an independent site to being owned by Gannett. Fortunately, the folks at Gannett, they were like, hey, we just kind of, we want to let you run it the way you want to run it. And so they kind of left us to our own devices, but it allowed them to have, this was as MMA was really growing. And within the USA Today family, they figured, well, we can either hire and build out a team, or we can go identify these guys that are doing it and killing it, and let's bring them under our umbrella. And that's what they did. So we would run MMA Junkie just as it was, and it was part of their family. But then when they wanted, like, the big stories on the big pay-per-views, then USA Today would run those. And then once we were owned by USA Today / Gannett, that's when things really changed. And the UFC, we weren't official broadcast partners like the way they are with, the people that air their programming, but they treated us pretty well and gave us, great access.
So for any of you that don't like use these sites, I mean, they were so pivotal. Like MMA Junkie was so pivotal to my fandom. So I'm going to date myself here, but I think I've said it before. I watched UFC 1 live, right? And then, now granted, I was in 7th grade and whatnot, but then eventually when I graduated college, I graduated in 01, 02. So December of 01, which January 02. I got into, go nowhere sales job that I absolutely hated. And I'd find myself sitting on my desk originally with Sherdog. Sherdog used to be my go-to. It was the first thing. It was the first ever site that I saw like covering Pride, which opened my eyes to Pride and Pancrase, right? And shoot bot, all that shoot fighting, even in Brazil and whatnot. And I was just like, oh my God, this is even deeper than I thought it was going. To then, it was probably around 06-ish, I got turned on to Junkie at that point, which then became my go-to. And it's just weird how things come full circle. Now me and you are hosting a show together, and you were so instrumental through Junkie about just developing my love for this sport, which all begs the question, how I originally, like, I didn't know it was you doing all this work. I read by John Morgan, never, but it wasn't until I would watch all these press conferences that the name John Morgan just started coming on. And before I get into the question that is coming, when did you become the guy that was the one in favor of the UFC? And I happen to think, I mean, you're pretty humble, so you're a great writer. You're very professional in your approach to everything. Is that kind of how you got in favor with the UFC, as being kind of like, and I always say this, like, you're almost like the Woj of MMA, like Woj is to NBA, like you're that into the UFC. And a lot of people have access to fighters, but you have them to both. How did that develop?
I think a big part of that is, and I appreciate all those kind of words, but I do think that was part of it. And in 2011, when Gannett bought us, and we were kind of talking about how do we take this thing to the next level, I told Dan Stupp and the team, I was like, look, because I come from that same fandom that you did, and I'm the same way. Like I read Sherdog, I read MMA Weekly, I read the Underground forums, but you know what it was at the time? There would be a UFC event as it was growing, and nobody was at every event. Like Sherdog would be on site for this event, or MMA Weekly would be on site for this event, but nobody was at everything. So you had to kind of figure out each week where you were going to get your on-site content from. And I told Dan, I was like, dude, let's go to everything. Like, let's be the site where every fan knows I know Junkie's there. I don't know where else I got to look. I'll get other content, but I know the MMA Junkie is on site, and let's go to everything. And I started traveling a lot, man. I was on the road a lot, you know, and that was when the UFC really started ramping up like international travel as well. So I was making the trips down to Brazil. I was going to Macau, you know what I mean? I was going on
traveling a lot, like to watch MMA fights. You're acting like we should feel sorry for you right now.
Oh no, not at all. Not
a lot.
Oh, that used to be my joke. People like, what do you do for a living? I'm like, I fly around, like I get paid to fly around the world and watch fights. You know what I mean? It's crazy. It was amazing. I will say, as I've gotten older, I have a 10-year-old son now, and I will say that I am trying to travel a little bit less these days, just because like I want to be there for his soccer games, his jiu-jitsu tournaments, just to pick him up from school and spend time. So I am trying to travel less. But at that time, I didn't have a kid yet, so man, I was all over the world. And I think that's when the relationship with the UFC really started to get deeper, because, you know, there would be shows where I'm the only familiar face. You know, we're in a foreign market and they're like, oh, I know that guy. You know, I'm familiar with him. Or, you know, some of these smaller fight night shows where, you know, there might not be much media that traveled. You know, it might just be the local guys or whatever. And so I think that's when it really started to change, when I was just at every event, like week in and week out.
Which begs the question. Now we see press conferences and what they were. But I can't remember a press conference in recent times as well that you haven't asked the first question. So I have affectionately in this podcast coined you as the first question guy. You know, you already have 30 nicknames to me, if you haven't realized yet. You know, you're the Woj, you're the first question guy, you know, you're the encyclopedia man, you're everything. How did you exactly? I already know this story, and I think it's really, really cool and brilliant on the UFC's, you know, part. But how did you become the first question guy?
Yeah, you know what's funny is I got to figure out when it happened as well, because I don't remember when it happened, but you're right. I mean, I do get this question a lot with people, but basically what happened is, you know, the way UFC press conferences used to happen, Dana White would come out like he does now. Hey, man, we're great to be here. We got a great card lined up for you, man. It's going to be amazing. Who's got the first question, you know? And then we would raise our hands as media members, and PR would have microphones with them, and they'd you know, come find you and, you know, get the so it takes a little bit, right? And so there started to be
that's just dead air, right? It's just dead air.
So it was these awkward pauses, right? Like you're trying to have this high energy. Like Dana's like, yeah, man, we're in your town. It's amazing. Who's got the first? And then you sit there for 30 seconds while you wait for it. So there would be these weird pauses. There were a couple of press conferences where Dana was actually like, what? Nobody's got any questions? Like nobody? And we're like, no.
I remember those times. And then it just started rattling off from there. But I remember those.
So Dave Schaller, who's the former head of PR with the UFC and is now a high-ranking exec with the Philadelphia 76ers, and who actually is the one that connected me with CFFC. So he's become a good friend over the years. But he came to me one day and he was like, hey, listen, man, look, I know that you always have questions, and I know that you always have good questions. Do you care if we just give you a microphone before the thing starts, so that when Dana says, who's got the first question, we don't have that weird pause where everything slows down and you just go? And I'm like, absolutely. I mean, let's do that. And so we started doing that. And just through that, you know, kind of mechanical thing, it was happening over months and over years. And you know, and it just kind of became a thing where now it's just that's the dude that asked the first question, and we know he all asked the first question. And it's actually still the same way we do things to this day. Like the UFC will come to me a couple minutes before the press conference is about to begin. They're like, hey, we're about to bring everybody on stage. Here's the mic. Let me check it's on. Yeah, here's your mic. You know, do you mind? And that's still how we do it at the press conferences to these days.
And obviously then they go give a mic to someone. They're rotating mics, right? And this is what cracks me up about this, which you're so good at your job. And I know you're humble, you're going to say it, but I'm going to say it for you. You're so good at your job. And you not only ask the obvious question, but you ask the follow-up to the obvious question, which then may or may not subvert other people that have it. And so I hear sometimes you have 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 questions leading out the gates. And other people are like, hey, Dana. And you just go right into your second question. Has that caused, do you get, like, to use, we're both fans of pro wrestling, has that gotten you any heat?
I mean, not to my face. I maybe behind my back, people are talking trash. And I will say this, I try to frame it as well. With how many media are there. You know what I mean? There are situations, especially, again, we're talking about the pandemic era where, like, a lot of companies didn't even allow journalists to travel or whatever. And so, you know, if there's a situation where there's 4 of us there, I'm probably going to ask more questions than if it's a situation where there's like 50 journalists there. And I know people have a lot to ask. But yeah, nobody's ever said it to my face. I'm sure behind the scenes, you're right. I'm sure like, I hate that guy.
I mean, and the reason I asked that question is because I was watching. It may have been after the Salt Lake one, and you were on like going into your second question, and somebody tried to jump in, and then you went into your third question. Somebody tried to jump in. I don't know if you recall that, but ironically, like to get ready for these shows, I go start watching old interviews and things like that, just to refresh my brain. And that's one thing that stuck out. So I had to ask that question.
It's
so
funny.
It's
That's
pretty funny.
I probably noticed it at the time. It didn't really stand out to me, but that's actually pretty funny.
Yeah. Okay. So going from that, you've been to probably 1,000 MMA events at this point, right? And what's a big memorable moment for you? Like if you were to say like, this is my most memorable moment of covering this sport, like epic Mount Rushmore, it's George Washington on Mount Rushmore. What is that moment?
It's interesting because there's so many of them, and some of them for what happens in the cage, and some of them for just like the trip itself. You know what I mean? Like just for one that has nothing to do with MMA. Like I remember going to Moscow for the UFC event out there and standing in Red Square. And to me, that was like, I always felt like Red Square was like a place like Americans weren't ever meant to be. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't for us. So, exactly. Stuff like that. So seeing parts of the world, some of that stuff stands out to me. But then the other thing is, it's not even always just the fight that happens in the cage. I mean, obviously I've been there. I want to figure out like how many UFC title fights I've been at someday, like sit down and count. I mean, I've seen so many championships won and defended and change hands. I mean, my gosh, the upset of Ronda Rousey with the big knockout of Holly Holm. I mean, that, these iconic moments in the sport, Conor McGregor, the champ win over Eddie Alvarez. I mean, iconic moments. But then there's just things like, George St. Pierre fighting in Montreal and the Bell Center being like, just so loud because he was such a phenomenal, the first stadium show at Skydome, UFC 129, and coming in and seeing the octagon in the middle of a baseball stadium and 60,000 people. Being in Brazil, the return to Brazil, seeing people cry when Big Nog, who's an absolute legend, I mean, winning and knocking out Brendan Schaub when everybody thought he was going to lose, and then looking around the crowd and people are legit crying because that dude is like such a hero down there. Going to Saitama Super Arena, like you, I was a fan of Pride, but I never got to go over there during the Pride era, so I never got to see that, but I always wanted to. While the UFC shows obviously weren't on the same scale as those Pride events were, still being in Saitama Super Arena and hearing that Japanese crowd that like is dead silent during the fights, but then like there's a guard pass and they all start clapping a guard pass. I'm like, the knowledge is off the charts, so many moments like that just will always stand out. And a lot of them have to do more so with like the place and the environment and the crowd and all that. I mean, just being able to be in there and soak that up and to be a part of it, man. I've been so incredibly lucky.
Well, that's awesome. And I mean, I've gotten to travel the world, 10 times over just in my career in the NBA and like little things like that. When you brought up the champ status, I watched that fight from a restaurant in Mexico. I was in Mexico City watching that fight live. It's just ironic. I'll never forget that. I want to apologize to absolutely nobody. I was like the only one like watching that fight. I was watching it on my phone from a restaurant in Mexico City. But with your close contact, one, to all the fighters, to all the promotions, whether that be Bellator, UFC, One Championship, PFL, like and there's some legendary statuses now or legendary little feuds. Like one currently kind of the Colby Covington, like you're not allowed to ask me a question unless you do XYZ first. But I would just have to think of dealing with like the most alpha of alpha males day in, day out. Like you have to have either some like just some crazy funny stories that go in that, or one where, you may have egg on your face where they just kind of called you out to something that you weren't expecting. And you're like, anything that top of mind?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the Colby Covington one right now is still a little bit of a sore subject for me. I'm not a big fan of it because I really don't understand it completely. I don't know if it's shtick or if it's real or what. But there's been
Can I educate the audience really quick?
Absolutely, feel free.
All right, so in the press conference, obviously Colby is either co-main or main all the time. So in the post-fight or pre-fight press conference, John Morgan, the first question guy, is obviously going to ask a question to either the co-main or the main event. And Colby Covington and the persona that he has right now, it's which I'm a fan of. Yeah, I want to say that. As a wrestling guy, I'm a fan of that persona. Sometimes maybe a little too far, but anytime you ask him a question, he says, I will not answer a question from you unless you do 20 push-ups. And truth be told, there's no way you can dignify yourself and do that.
No. Yeah, it's unfortunate because, to be honest with you, I actually do like Colby Covington a lot. I think it was his first or second fight, which was in Macau. He's one of the few English-speaking fighters that were there. So I interviewed him very early in his career. And I've had a good relationship with him over the years, to be honest with you. And so I don't know where this all came from. I don't know if it's just stick. Like, basically, I think he said that he thought I said he wasn't deserving of a title shot. I never said anything like that. But yeah, he's like, drop down and give me push-ups. Before you ask a question. I'm like, I'm not going to do that. You know what I mean? Like, that's just ridiculous. I'm here doing my job, whatever. So
do other media personalities snicker at that? Do they laugh and do they humor him into that?
Actually, I mean, I think look, the first time he did it was in a press conference in New York. If you watch the tape, I laughed. I was like, I guess it's my turn to catch the Colby Covington shrapnel today. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, but then it just kept going. So like post fight, he wouldn't answer. And the next press conference, he wouldn't answer. So I was just like, all right, I'm done with it. So the first time even I laughed. Like, I love the Colby person because what's funny about Colby Covington that I always tell people is like that shtick that he has. And I mean, at this point, everybody realizes, it's shtick or whatever. But like behind the scenes, whenever we had interviews and stuff set up, man, he would always be like early to it. You know what I mean? And show it. And you have great, I mean, he's professional. He'd come in, hey, how you doing? And you'd have this, it was so funny because you'd have this great conversation off air and you're like, oh, cool. We're going to get the real Colby Covington today. And then you hit record on the camera and he goes into the shtick. But I get it. Look at him. He's a great fighter, but unfortunately, right, he's got a very wrestling-based style, which is not the most fan-friendly style. So how do you get people to like? I mean, he was having great success kind of before he became this over-the-top character. But then once he became that over-the-top character, that's when people really started tuning in and watching. So I don't blame it, man. He's out there trying to get paid and trying to do his thing.
He's made himself a millionaire with it.
Yeah, he has. I think honestly it just bugs me because I don't know if it's just a joke or if he really thinks I said something that he doesn't deserve a title shot, which I never said. I'm not that guy that's going to be disrespectful like that. I mean, he is absolutely earned. He's the second best guy in the division, man. There's no question about it. So I think that's one of the things that bothers me is that, had it been for something I actually said, I would stand behind it and be like, well, that was my opinion. If you don't like it and you don't like me because of it, that's okay. But I think it's all a misunderstanding. And then that's if it's even real. I don't even know if it's real. I have tried to reach out to him behind the scenes. I've talked to his coaches. I've texted him directly. Didn't hear anything back. So that's an unfortunate one. But I'll tell you one that's less bothersome. I've had a couple of his. One of the funniest ones.
And I've had a couple of these.
There's a couple of them. One of the funniest ones was Tyron Woodley, actually. So, when we got bought by Gannett, right? The USA Today people, they wanted us to start doing picks. We never did. Me and Dan, we never did like staff picks. Because we just didn't want to show favoritism. We didn't want to like show.
In which we stay away from on this show. I completely understand why. You have to interface with these people.
That's right. You have to go cover them and you want to look like you're not biased. So we never did picks. But Gannett was like, no, you got to do picks. Readers want to see expert analysis. And I'm like, you're right. But so at the time, I'm like, well, all right, we'll do it. And I thought, well, nobody's really going to see them anyway, right? Like, who cares? It's just our picks.
Famous last words.
Swear to God, dude. I think it was the second card we picked. It was over in Macau. It was like it was Tyron Woodley versus Dong Young Kim. And the story on Tyron Woodley at the time was, this was before he was champ, that he was good, but when he got in these pressure situations, when he got at the very top, he would choke, for lack of a better word. He wouldn't perform up to his standards. Well, now when he's in the main event, he's in Macau, he goes out there, he scores a big win. We're at the post-fight press conference. He's there. Dana White's right there. And I'm like, Tyron, I know the story on you has always been in the big spotlight. You don't get things done. Now your boss is right there next to you. Is there any kind of message you want to send to him after this big win? He's like, the only thing I really know is that you picked the wrong person, John, because I had picked Dong Young Kim. I had picked against them. So here I am in our second picks thinking nobody's ever going to see who we pick anyway. And Tyron Woodley saw it, and he called me out for picking the wrong guy in the fight. And it was funny, man. I was like, damn, here we go. But it does go to show you, to your point, the fighters do see this stuff. You know what I mean? Yeah. And they get it, man. And they're
fans of this sport too.
Absolutely. And they take it personal. And I get it, right? I mean, it's one thing that this sport is, and it's what makes it so beautiful, but it's also what makes it so tough is that, you can't, like, let's say you lose a game. Let's say, the Grizzlies lose a basketball game or whatever. But a player on the team could say, yeah, that sucks, but I still feel like I played pretty damn good today. I got my numbers. I was leading.
Yeah, and on to tomorrow.
That's right. And on to the next one. And in mixed martial arts, first of all, when people are picking against you, they're just picking against you, like not your team.
Yeah.
They're saying you are not good enough to win this fight against this other individual. And as you said, the other thing about it, man, is you don't get to go back out there. It's not baseball where you play 162 and you just go back out there. Well, we got 5 more games this week. You might not fight again. If you're lucky, you fight again in 3 months. It may be 6. It may be 8. It may be, and you've got to sit on that loss for all that time. So it's tough. So I get it. Fighters see this stuff and they are sensitive to it, man, and it does bother them. So Tyron called me out. It's pretty funny. The other one that's kind of a famous one, and I almost hate telling the story because we've moved past it, this individual. And it's actually really funny because, I told you the first UFC I ever went to was UFC 16. I took a picture there with Vitor Belfort. I think we're both around the same age. I think we're both like 20 years old. And I actually recently found the picture. I totally forgot it existed, but my mom was like cleaning up my old room at my house. And she's like, do you remember this? And sent me the picture. I'm like, oh my God, I don't. Like, I remember it now, but I had forgotten it existed.
What year was this?
1998.
Okay, so Phenom.
Phenom era. The picture's hilarious. I put it on my Instagram. I'll put it up here. I'll put it up here so we can take it. It's a crazy picture. But anyway, years later, we're at a press conference in Brazil, and this is when this is the TRT era when testosterone replacement therapy was okay, and people were taking.
This is head kick Bisping era.
Head kick Bisping era, right? And it was actually, I believe it was the Luke Rockhold fight when he had it. And immediately I look on social media and everybody's just like, oh, great knockout, but TRT cheating. And so I asked him, I was like, does it bother you? Because listen, again, it was kind of a controversial thing. Like if you're taking testosterone, now it's clearly a performance enhancer, but you still got to throw the kick. You still got to throw the punch,
and
right?
And he had an exemption. He was allowed to do it.
He was allowed to do it. So what I asked him was, does it bother you that, when you do these amazing things, because he had a great knockout, like when you have these amazing highlights, that people immediately just turn and say, yeah, but that's because you're doing this, when that's not really the technique. I guess it's kind of like maybe a Barry Bonds thing where, I guess he was actually cheating, but he did still have to hit the baseballs, right? He didn't have an exemption to take the stuff. You still got to hit the baseball. Same thing in MMA. You still got to throw the punch. You still got to throw the kick. You still got to have the technique. And so that's kind of what I wanted to ask him, to give him an opportunity to address it, And in Portuguese, we were in Brazil. In Portuguese, he said, like, can somebody beat this guy up? Can somebody, let's get this guy out of here and beat him up because, the stupid questions or whatever. And to the media's credit, they told me afterwards what he said, and they all basically condemned him and said, hey, man, just, that's BS what just happened there. We're not okay with that. But so that happened, and I didn't take it personally. I understood, like I understood it was a delicate situation. It was a controversial time, and I know that Vitor was tired of hearing about it, and so I was just the one that caught the shrapnel. But I will say this, and one of the reasons I hate telling the story is because Vitor and I ran into each other like a month later or something, and we just happened to be on the same connecting flight in Brazil and sitting across from each other in the aisle. And just by chance, we were, I was like 8C and 8D or whatever, And he absolutely.
What'd you think at first when you're walking down the aisle and you see him sitting there? Shit!
Nah, look, we actually started talking in the airport, and then it was like, oh, we're actually together. And the thing is, like, I had known Vitor before from, actually, of course, I'd met him when I was 20, but then he lived in Las Vegas for a while, and so we saw him a lot and talked. So again, it was one of those things that surprised me, like with the Colby thing. I was like, oh, I'm surprised that you're mad at me. But anyway, he talked to me afterwards and really apologized. I was like, man, he's like, I overreacted. I understand what you were trying to do. You were trying to give me an opportunity to address this topic. And I came at you aggressively. And I'm really, really sorry about that. And we ended up having like a 3-hour conversation and just kind of, reminiscing and talking it out. And now, I consider Vitor a friend. You know what I mean? He's very, very kind to me. And that's why I say I almost hate to tell the story because I hate to bring it up. But I would be remiss if I didn't, because when you ask, have I ever had these blowups? That was definitely one that was kind of wild where, he was kind of saying somebody should hurt me. But fortunately, nobody did. Fortunately, everybody in Brazil was very supportive. And fortunately, myself and Vitor worked through it very shortly afterwards and our friends. But look, I get it, man. This is, again, and it's one of the reasons I try to be so respectful when I do, even if we're talking about something controversial, even if we're talking about something that, I try not to shy away from addressing topics that I feel like need to be addressed, but I also feel there's a respectful way to do it. There's a time and a place for everything. There's a way to ask everything in a respectful manner. I don't think you have to be, even if you're talking about something that is not fun to talk about, I don't think you have to be disrespectful about it. So I try to be respectful, because this is, and you're well familiar with it, man. This is, in a lot of ways, the loneliest sport in the world, man. When they say the highest of highs and the lowest of lows, man. It is not a cliche, man. You win a fight, I mean, you have just gone out and inflicted physical damage. You have proven yourself the alpha male or alpha female, and it's the greatest feeling on earth. And everybody's like, wow, you're amazing. I love you. And when you lose, you just got your ass kicked in front of your friends and family, in front of thousands of people, millions of people around the world, and ain't nobody reaching out to you. Your phone's not blowing up. No, you know what I mean? It's like people, and it's a weird thing because when somebody loses, it is the lowest of low. And in some ways you kind of think, oh man, they probably want to be, respectfully, they want their time and they want to, but in reality, if these are people, if these are people you consider friends, it's when they lose that you need to reach out to them, not when they win. When they win, their phone, their social media is blowing up. You're one of a million, man. They might not even remember your message. When they lose, nobody's calling them, man, and nobody's reaching out to them, and they feel like absolute dirt. And if you can reach out to them at that time, that's when you need to. It is. So I understand the highs and lows, the emotions, man. I think it's one of the things that I respect so much about this game. Kind of now I'm just rambling, but it's kind of fun conversation. I actually just sent a tweet this weekend. Terrence McKinney, I was flying back yesterday. I was just on social media, killing some time on the plane. And he asked, what's the most memorable answer anybody's ever given you in an interview? And I'm like, Jesus, how do you? But the one thing that stood out to me, because one of the things I love about the sport is the psychology and stuff that's around it as well. And I remember one that'll always stand out to me was Cowboy Cerrone, the legend, the now retired Cowboy Cerrone, who's going into the UFC Hall of Fame, no question about it. The dude that was anybody, anywhere, anytime. I mean, that dude lived up to that, persona of anybody, anywhere, anytime. But I remember talking to him, and this was late stages of his career, and he was talking about how he absolutely gets nervous before every fight, throws up in the locker room before every fight. Every time before he's about to walk out there, he's telling his coaches, I ain't never doing this again. Like, what the hell are we doing? This is nuts. You know what I mean?
Right.
And then he goes and does it and can't wait for the next one. And I remember what a revelation that was, man. I'm like, if the anybody, anytime, anywhere guy is puking in the locker room before a fight every single time, that just goes to show you that everybody's nervous. And if athletes, the fighters, if they're honest, they'll tell you, like, hell yeah, there's nerves. Like, you feel it every single time, man. And it's such a weird psychology because, again, if stuff popped off in a bar one night and they had to defend themselves, anybody on the roster would clear out the whole place because they're highly trained, highly skilled. But, man, when you got that psychology of, I got this signed piece of paper on this contract that I know in 6 weeks I got to show up in front of this big arena, in front of this big crowd, and train and go against this other trained killer who has been doing nothing but preparing for me over the past 6 weeks as well. It's a weird thing, man. It's a weird thing.
So it's completely serendipitous here because what spawned my idea to have this deep dive into John Morgan today stemmed from that tweet I read of yours yesterday from Terrence McKinney.
That's funny.
That was the genesis of, like, scrap everything I'm talking about because it's a slow week. Let's do a deep dive, and that, in all honesty. So we only have a few minutes left here today, and
thank Terrence McKinney. Thank you, Terrence McKinney.
Yeah, thank you. Shout out. Listen, you're the name on the marquee, but in full transparency, I'm here a little bit too, right? I kind of lead the show, but hey, let's turn it around. Let's let the audience, if you want to ask me any questions right now, I won't. We got a few minutes. How I got into it, whatever you want to know, I'm here for you.
Well, I was going to say, I would like to hear your journey as well, because as you said, we've become friends through the sport. We met each other through CFFC and through your job as an official, which, by the way, I always appreciate anybody that takes on the role of official as well, because it's not the most glamorous role, right? I mean, a mixed martial arts referee or even a judge it's got to be one of the most difficult jobs out there. And it's so underappreciated because if you do your job right, nobody talks about you. It's just what you were supposed to do. And if you do it wrong, if something happens wrong, people just annihilate you on the internet and in your social media and all that. So I really don't know your journey, to be honest with you, other than where you're at.
So 2007. I'm working here in Memphis. I'm originally from Arizona. My brother was a, standout wrestler, all state, went and wrestled in college, got into kind of submission grappling afterwards. Now, mind you, I watched UFC 1. I got hooked at UFC 1. I was in like 7th grade. I was like, holy this is crazy, but I am hooked. And it was on one of those illegal black boxes that you could descramble the cable. That's how I watched UFC 1, right?
Hopefully the statute of limitations out on that.
Sorry, Cox Cable. So anyhow, after college, I just get into the workforce. I move out to Memphis. I'm working for the Memphis Grizzlies, and I get diagnosed with cancer. So 2007, I'm diagnosed with cancer. It was so bad that I was given a 30% chance to live through the weekend at one point. From infections and whatnot. And it was really, really bad. I was in ICU for 2 months. I had to learn how to walk again because I had such bad muscle atrophy. I was sedated for 6 weeks. Coming out of that, luckily I was young enough, I was healthy enough that I was able to recover. I beat cancer. I don't want to dive too much into that, maybe at a later date. But it really bothered me that everybody was like, oh, you look at everybody's problems and must laugh because of what you went through. And I'm like, that's not really the way it works. Like, guess what? Just because I was able to do this doesn't mean I don't hate sitting in traffic. Doesn't mean like these, completely, obnoxious little meaningless problems don't bother me. Of course they did. So I'm a weird guy. Like I internally think of things a little different than I think most people. And so I need to prove to myself that I am mentally tough. So guess what I did? I said, you know what? I'm going to start training and I'm going to do an MMA fight to prove to myself for no other reason that I am mentally tough. Because as you've stated, the mental aspect is way harder than the physical. It's 100% true. Harder. So I started training in 2015. I ended up making my amateur debut. And, I was training now, granted, I was in horrendous shape coming out of cancer. So I had to train for a couple of years, even to get back in decent shape. Then I really dived into, doing Muay Thai, then dived into jiu-jitsu, which then you got to be years getting training at this level now to even make an amateur debut. It's unbelievable, the talent. Ended up making an amateur debut. I score a very quick 50-second TKO victory. Now let temper it. This guy barely could tie his shoes, right? He came off the couch. I came off of a 2-year training camp.
Hey, a win's a win.
A win's a win. I made the walk. He made the walk. Much respect. I didn't get out of it what I thought I was because it was so quick. So I said, hey, I'm going to make another one. I'm going to do another one. I did another fight. And I came from a wrestling background, right? So I'm a pretty good wrestler. I then, scored another first round TKO ground and pound knockout. And then the Memphis Grizzlies were like, if you're going to keep doing this, we may need to, re-examine our contract with each other because they couldn't have me missing any games and time away from the team if I've got hurt because I ended up shattering my hand in that fight. So I just said, okay, well, can I do jiu-jitsu? I got into jiu-jitsu, fell in love with it so much that, I started going to a lot of IBJJF tournaments. I won the 2015 Nogi Blue Belt World Championships, which is super cool. Blue belt, but a win's a win, and especially at that level. It's pretty neat. Just got more and more. And then I love the sport of MMA that I needed to get involved. I couldn't fight anymore because I needed to make money. And so I got into judging. Judging then led to reffing. And I always said, like, I always need to get closer. It's the way I am. I got to do the next thing. I did timekeeping. Now I got to be a judge. I was a judge. Oh, now I've got to be a ref. I was a ref. Now I need to do commentary. But I just really fell in love with reffing because the type of person that I am, I'm a very black and white guy, just in every aspect of my life. There's right, there's wrong, there's up and down, there's left and right. There's very little in between with me. And I know a lot of people aren't that way. That's just how I am in my DNA. So that's why reffing was so appealing to me because, like, listen, the rule is the rule. It's not up to me. I didn't determine the rule. I just enforce the rule. Plus, with now, I think I'm a purple belt in jiu-jitsu at the time when I started reffing, is I can understand where the fight's about to go. What I despise about a lot of refs is they're not proficient anywhere, let alone everywhere in a lot of cases. They're off the couch. They're fans. They go through some training. They get booked by commissions and they F up a lot of fights. Well, where then I understood, okay, I understand footwork now from my time of training. I understand if they're on the ground, where it's going to go. I understand if somebody's in a deep armbar and one belly's down, I need to get on the side where I can just see or hear him because he can't even tap. I learned these nuances through training. And then I developed my training, did ABC, whatnot. And I just fell in love with reffing. And I fell in love with reffing for the same reason I kind of really fell in love with fighting, is because I don't get the nerves judging. I don't get the nerves being a timekeeper, but being that man in there, it just makes you feel alive. Even if you're not supposed to be seen, if you were not seen, you did a great job. And if you were, you effed up. And I always aim not to be seen. And that's kind of how I got into reffing. And I got some crazy stories reffing, man.
That's awesome, man. It's such a tough job. I mean, I'm not just saying this just because it's you, but anybody. I mean, and understand when you're critical of referees, it's fair to critique referees if you think they make a bad
Absolutely.
decision. But it is a very difficult job, man, because split-second decisions and really, decisions that end fights, not decisions that you're like, oh, well, that was a questionable penalty. Well, we'll get you with a makeup call down on the other end. You know what I mean? It's not like that. You're making decisions that mean, win or loss and the end fights. And the other thing is don't shy away also from the responsibility that you're tasked with of fighter safety, of these athletes'
Absolutely.
health, man. This is at its core, mixed martial arts is a dangerous sport, but that's why we have regulation in place. And the mentality of these athletes is one that, you do have to kind of save them from themselves sometimes. I mean, look no further than Aaron Pico. The guy wants to keep fighting. You're like, no, you can't fight.
And here's the crazy part is like in most fights now, like on regional level, like lower level amateur, like push comes to shove, 50-50 scenario, I could handle myself against the guys. It just depends on the matchup and the level of it, right? When you start getting into these bigger shows like these CFFC cards, like there's no way. Like, but you have to present yourself as the alpha of alphas in there. And that's kind of like where that black or white comes to me. No. This was wrong. You made a foul. End of discussion.
Yep.
And you just need to learn to cut it off there. But I'm glad you brought up fighter safety because I did thinking about this. I wanted to tell this one story and about how dangerous this sport is and how pivotal a ref's job is. Now, it was a CFFC card. You ironically were not there. You were in Abu Dhabi covering, and I don't know if you recall the story. If you know the story I'm about to tell.
I was watching it, man. It was wild, man. It was a wild.
Jordan Tony. I'll never forget these guys. Jordan Tony, out of Colorado, in the main event. He is fighting Pat Sabatini. Yes, that Pat Sabatini who is in the UFC now and making a lot of waves. And this essentially everybody knew, whoever wins has got a contract on the line. And that's where I ascended to this level of reffing. And through an exchange, Pat Sabatini hurt Jordan Tony very, very badly, but he is still intelligently defending himself. His arms are up. He's still weaving. He's weaving. He got knocked down. He got right back up. He stuffed, I think even believe he stuffed a takedown at one point where then Sabatini then uncorked with 3 other massive shots. And the eyes tell you everything. As a ref, that's why you got to be in there. And that's how you got to be trained. And that's how you got to, you need to have trained in combat sports at some point because the eyes are going to tell you a lot. And I saw Tony's eyes not there, even though his reflexes and his hands were up and bobbing and weaving, but he took 3 massive shots where I jumped in as they're still on the feet, which I don't think a lot of referees are going to do. Bear in mind, I think 90% of them are not going to stop a fight on its feet. I jumped in, I pulled Pat Sabatini off, and he was a littler guy, so I was literally able to just grab him, pick him up, and walk him over. He goes running away celebrating, and I see Jordan Tony starting to take a couple steps, and he collapses face forward. I knew from the way he collapsed that it was not bad. It was very bad. Now, mind you, he took 2 steps before collapsing, so much that he collapsed so limp wise that I grabbed his arm on the way down because I didn't want him to hurt himself on the collapse. I yell for the doctor in right away. Now, this is height of the pandemic. No fans in there. And it's just like dead air, like holy smokes. Luckily, they went to the commentary and not a lot of people understood at the time the severity, but he was no heartbeat, not breathing. Going from standing, breathing, reflexes to face first, no breathing. We roll him, me and the doctor, I called for him immediately. He gets in there and the doctor is kind of like trying to revive him. You see him like, wake up, wake up, wake up. I'm down by his torso and I'm seeing it's not raising and going up or down. And I go, and I'm mic'd up and there's no crowd in there. So it's quiet. And I go to the doctor, I go, he's not breathing. And the doctor couldn't hear because they have music piped in. And he goes, what? And I go, he's not breathing. He goes, what? And I go, he's not effing breathing. And then the doctor was like, oh my God, what? And then he's like, go get the paramedics, go get this, go get that. Thank goodness. I make a long story short. Thank goodness that they were able to revive him. He ended up being perfectly fine. But it was the scariest moment as a ref that I've ever had. So much that I ended up almost quitting reffing altogether. I had to go through an investigation with the athletic commission that night. CFF's credit, the president, Rob, what's his last name?
Rob Haydeck.
He came to me that next day. It was a back-to-back show. He came to me the next day and he says, listen, that was the best piece of reffing I've ever seen. Nobody would have stopped that fight while they were still on their feet. And I'm convinced it's the only reason they're alive. And he goes, anytime you want, you have a job here. And I was just like, man, and it really just regained my confidence because I was shook. I was shook. But then the one reason of quitting made me want to stay because I realized in that moment how important the job of a referee really is. And I take it with deadly seriousness when I'm in that cage.
Absolutely, man. You have to. That's it. I remember watching that scene play out I was watching it on Fight Pass and man, it was scary to say the least. So for you to be right there, literally in the middle of it and not only just observing it, but a part of it, man, I cannot imagine. And you know, I could totally understand why you'd want to walk away, but exactly that, you know, it's like, but we need people like you. You know what I mean? We need people like you with the passion, the commitment, the professionalism, the dedication to make the sport. Because again, look at its core, this is hand-to-hand combat. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so while it's an incredible sport and an incredible display of athleticism, if it's not done correctly, it can be very dangerous. And so we need people like yourself to make sure and ensure that these fighters, you know, can remain safe through this competition. So, man, wow, that's crazy. I hadn't thought about that in a while, man. I remember that. So tense.
Oh, man, and it was crazy. I didn't know what to do. I'm yelling for the paramedics. Get in here. They forgot their defibrillator. I go, and I'm cursing up. So get the effing defibrillator. Like, I'm trying to be composed, but I'm trying to get urgency. And thank God the doctor was there where it was off me at that point. And then, man, it was a wild situation. But this was like, listen, we ended it kind of on a downer. I have a funny one. I've had fighters beat me up while they were unconscious as a ref. I've had to, you know, literally fight, not grapple a little bit, literally fight fighters because they go into instinct mode when they're unconscious. And the first thing they're swinging on. I probably took 8 unanswered blows before I eventually had to do something about it in one fight. That's another funny story. That was like literally like my 3rd event ever reffing. Man, that almost made me quit too because he was a heavyweight. Now, thank God he had no wits to him, so I was able to handle my situation. He was a debut amateur too, so thank goodness. But fun episode, man. We learned a lot about you moving from Dallas to all these other places, Ohio to Vegas, becoming the first question guy, your beefs with fighters, your makeups with fighters. Man, I actually loved everything about this episode. And everybody listening, listen to us more. You can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. You can watch this episode on YouTube, grindcitymedia.com. Now, I do just have to mention that we do have a UFC fight night coming up. We'll kind of give you a recap of it. But UFC fight night, Alexis Grasso versus Vivian Araújo, Cub Swanson, and Jonathan Martinez are kind of your co-main event. So with that being said, next week, I actually hit something on my screen. I'm sorry, guys. With next week, we'll go over that. And plus, it's finally time to dive into another UFC pay-per-view. I am totally stoked for this in Abu Dhabi, a triple main event. Are we going to be able to call that a triple main event?
Have to, man. Everybody's excited about that. This, again, no disrespect to the fighters on this week's card. There's another great one as far as Askar Askarov versus Brandon Royval. That's a great fight at flyweight. So there's some fun fights on it. But, man, when you've got the blockbuster that is UFC 280 looming
just
out
get
there,
me there.
That's it, man. It's just like, let's get to this fight card. It is stacked.
Yeah, just get me to this. I can't wait. For John Morgan, I'm Eric McMahon. Watch us next week right here on Cageside with John Morgan.